Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, so get this. Over 60%, more than 60% of adults in the U.S. say they've gone through at least one really tough thing in their childhood.
Wow, that's a big number.
It is. Makes you think, right? How can something from so long ago when we were kids, like way back when, still have an impact today?
It's fascinating, really.
That's exactly what we're going to dig into today. How stress early in life can, have these lasting effects on our brains and how we act. And we're not just talking about huge traumas, although those are obviously important too.
Right.
We're going to uncover how even the things you might not think about, those little unpredictable things that happen when we were young, can really change things for us down the line.
Exactly. Like, have you ever wondered how those seemingly small, random events from your past could still be shaping your experiences today?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. We're going to be pulling from a super in-depth scientific review article called The Evolving Neurobiology of Early Life Stress, and another piece that tackles this big question: how contemporary stressful experiences lead to long-lasting issues?
Those are great sources to dive into for this.
For sure. So what we're aiming for today is to really break down the main ways that stress in early life, even the stuff we often miss, can shape your emotional and thinking well-being over the long haul. And we're going to do this without getting too technical, so you don't need a PhD to follow along. We want to give you a clear, easy-to-understand picture of what's most important for you to know.
Definitely. It's all about making this complex topic accessible for everyone.
Exactly. So first things first, how common is this early life stress thing, really? Like, are we talking about a handful of people, or is this something that touches a lot of lives?
Well, if you think about that statistic you just threw out there, over 60%, that's a pretty solid indication that this isn't some rare phenomenon.
Right. So we're talking about a majority of people.
Absolutely. We're talking about a majority of adults in the United States having faced at least one significant stressor in their childhood. And these are often called, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short.
ACEs. Got it.
And the research is crystal clear on this. Going through these early stresses is strongly linked to a higher chance of having a whole bunch of negative health outcomes later in life.
So, like, what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Well, it's a pretty wide range, actually. We're talking mental health challenges, things like anxiety and depression. But it also goes beyond that into physical problems, things like obesity, even heart disease, and problems with blood vessels.
So it's not just in your head, it's affecting your physical health too.
Exactly. It's all connected.
It's kind of overwhelming to think about just how many people are dealing with the effects of this.
It really is. And it goes beyond individual suffering, too. It's a massive societal issue.
In what way?
Well, think about the economic burden alone. Back in 2019, the estimated annual cost just in the U.S. was a staggering $742 billion. And get this, recent estimates, especially after everything that's happened recently with the pandemic and everything, have skyrocketed.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is something like $14 trillion. That kind of jaw-dropping figure really highlights why understanding this whole early life stress thing is so crucial. If we can wrap our heads around it, we've got a much better shot at preventing it and figuring out ways to lessen its impact, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
Totally. So we've established it's common, it's a big deal, both for individuals and for us as a society. So how did we even start to understand the impact of these early experiences?
Well, there was this one really groundbreaking study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or AC study as it's often called.
Like ACE study, right?
And it was huge for this field. It really drove home this idea that the impact of early life stress, it's not just a one-off thing. It accumulates over time. Like, they found this step-by-step connection between the number of difficult things someone went through in childhood, things like neglect, abuse or dysfunction within the family, things like violence or substance abuse, and their chances of having negative health outcomes throughout their lives.
So the more you go through, the harder it gets.
Exactly. The more adverse experiences, the higher the risk. And there's this concept of allostatic load that comes into play here.
Allostatic load, what's that exactly?
It's basically a way of thinking about your body's ability to bounce back from stress, especially when it's ongoing or happening over and over again. Like, every time you face a stressful event, your body's systems get thrown off balance, and it becomes harder and harder to get back to that stable state, that homeostasis.
So it's like your resilience wears down.
Precisely. The more stressful stuff you experience, the tougher it is for your body and brain to recover. And that helps explain why this whole cumulative impact of adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs, is so impactful on your long-term health.
It's like carrying a heavier and heavier backpack. At
Yeah.
some point, it just gets too much.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So this ACE score, just counting up those difficult experiences, became a pretty widely used tool. But the article also mentions it's not the whole story.
Yeah, that's an important nuance to understand. While ACE scores are great for looking at big groups of people and spotting trends and risks, they're not so great at predicting what'll happen to a single person.
Why not?
A few reasons. First off, they don't factor in genetics. Some folks might just be naturally more resilient or sensitive to stress thanks to their genes.
Right, so it's not just about what happens to you, it's also about how you're wired.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And it also doesn't consider those positive things that can help you cope with stress. Things like having a supportive family or strong community ties. Those can be huge buffers against stress.
It's like having a safety net.
Exactly. Plus, the ACE score lumps all these different bad experiences together. But we all know that the specifics matter. Like, neglect is different from physical abuse, and both will likely affect a developing brain differently.
So it's not just about how much bad stuff happens, but what kind of bad stuff.
Exactly. And that brings us to this idea that early life stress isn't just this one big blob. There are different flavors, so to speak.
Flavors, okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah, so researchers are starting to realize that different types of stress can actually lead to different outcomes.
Interesting.
The thought is that we can look at stress on different scales, like dimensions. For example, some have pointed to threat, experiences with fear or danger, and deprivation, like missing out on essential things like care and emotional support, as two key dimensions. And the mix of these, how intense they are, could then influence how mental health outcomes play out.
So someone who faced a lot of threat might always be on edge, while someone who is deprived might have a harder time with emotions, their own, or understanding other people's.
That's the kind of distinction researchers are exploring to really grasp the different ways early adversity can impact people. And some studies do back up those ideas, like kids exposed to high levels of threat tend to zero in on negative things around them, whereas those who experience a lot of deprivation have a tougher time reading emotions in others.
Makes sense?
But other research suggests it's even more complex than that.
How so?
Well, there might be even more dimensions of early life stress, not just those two.
So more flavors to consider.
Exactly. Plus, even within those categories, things can vary a lot. Like physical abuse and witnessing violence at home are both forms of threat, but they might affect a child differently.
Right, the details matter.
They really do. It's all about acknowledging the complexity of early life stress and how it can have these really unique impacts on development.
This is all super helpful in understanding the bigger picture. And then the article mentions this kind of early life stress that maybe hasn't gotten as much attention before.
Yeah.
Unpredictable early life experiences. That sounds like something we should really get into.
Oh, absolutely. For a long time, the focus was mainly on those big, adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, lack of resources. And don't get me wrong, those are super important.
Right.
But they don't explain everything. Like, why do some people struggle after difficult childhoods while others seem to do just fine? There was this gap in our understanding.
And that's where unpredictability comes in.
Precisely. Over the past decade or so, there's been this growing understanding that unpredictable sensory signals coming from parents, caregivers, even the environment, are another really significant form of early life stress. Think about it. Kids thrive on consistency. When those signals are all over the place, it can be incredibly stressful for their developing brains.
So how do researchers actually measure this unpredictability in their studies?
They use different methods. In animal studies, they might track a mother's caregiving behaviors, like how often and for how long she engages in nurturing activities and how predictable those patterns are.
Sounds detailed.
It is. They use a measure called entropy to quantify this unpredictability. Imagine it like a rhythm. If a parent's responses are like a steady beat, unpredictability is like that beat changing randomly, no clear pattern. Entropy measures that chaos.
Interesting. And how do they study it in humans?
For human infants and kids, they might analyze videos of parent-child interactions, looking at how consistent the visual, tactile, and auditory signals are. They also use questionnaires asking about a child's experience of unpredictability in their environment over time.
And what have they found when they connect this unpredictability in early life with later outcomes?
The findings are pretty significant. Studies show that unpredictable environments early on are strongly tied to negative developmental outcomes in kids and teens. This includes things like problems with cognitive development and learning, plus a higher risk for anhedonia as an adult, which is basically a decreased ability to feel pleasure, and even PTSD.
That's heavy stuff.
It is. And the kicker is this link between unpredictability and those negative outcomes holds true even when you account for those classic ACEs.
So it's like its own separate risk factor. The article even mentioned a study suggesting it could significantly increase the likelihood of depression.
Exactly. One ongoing study following a large group of children suggests that unpredictable early life experiences can boost the chances of developing depression by, get this, 4 to 7 times, even without any other major adverse childhood experiences. That's a game changer in how we think about the roots of mental health.
Wow. But there's a silver lining, right? The fact that this kind of stress, the unpredictability, might be easier to address with interventions.
Exactly. If we can create more stable and predictable environments for kids, especially early on, we might be able to lessen some of those negative effects on their development.
That's definitely encouraging to hear. The article also touches on how this impact of early life stress isn't evenly distributed across society.
Right. We know folks in low-resource communities and minority groups often face more of these early life stresses. This ties into systemic issues, and there's a lot of research trying to figure out how these societal factors contribute to early adversity and how it shapes brain development in different populations.
So it's not just about individual experiences, it's about the context those experiences happen in.
Exactly. And it's not just about social stuff either. The article also points to things like pollution and extreme weather as early life stressors we need to understand better.
Right, those environmental factors.
Exactly. As our world changes, we're realizing that pollution, both air and water, and the increasing frequency of extreme weather events can also act as stressors during those crucial early years. And while we're starting to see that these can have negative impacts, we still need to figure out the long-term consequences for mental health and well-being.
So it's this really complex web of factors that can influence us from a young age.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
We've talked about what early life stress is, all those different forms, but let's get to the heart of it. How can these temporary stressful experiences early on lead to such long-lasting problems with our emotions and the way we think?
That's where the brain comes in, and both of our sources offer some really fascinating insights into that. One key finding, which is supported by animal studies where you can really control the stress, is that stress experienced during sensitive developmental periods, those windows of time when the brain is rapidly growing and making connections, can lead to changes in behavior that last into adulthood.
So it's like those early experiences leave a permanent mark.
In a way, yeah.
So what's happening at a really basic level in the brain during those early stressful times that could explain those long-term changes? The article talks about epigenomics and transcriptomics.
Okay, yeah, those are some big words. But basically, it's all about how those early experiences, including stress, can actually change how our genes are expressed in brain cells.
So even though our DNA, our genes, stay the same, those early experiences can change how those genes actually work.
Exactly. Think of your genes like a cookbook, and the recipes are the instructions for making proteins, which do all sorts of important jobs in your body and brain. Epigenomics is like adding little notes to those recipes without actually changing the ingredients. It can make some recipes more or less likely to be used. Transcriptomics, on the other hand, is like looking at which recipes are actually being used at any given time and how much of each dish is being made. Early stress can mess with both of these processes, affecting which genes are active and how much protein they produce in specific areas of the brain.
So it's like changing the volume knob on certain genes.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's not just about turning genes on or off. It's about fine-tuning their activity.
Fascinating. And the article also talks about how early life stress can affect the actual physical structure of the brain, like the connections between brain cells.
Right, so our brains develop by forming these intricate networks of connections between brain cells, kind of like a complex wiring system. And those connections get strengthened or weakened depending on our experiences, especially during those early years.
It's like building a road system. The more traffic on a certain road, the wider and more established it becomes.
Exactly. And early sensory experiences, the things we see, hear, touch, smell, taste, play a huge role in shaping those brain networks. It's like those experiences are the traffic that strengthens or weakens those connections. When those experiences are consistent and predictable, those connections get reinforced in a healthy way. But when they're chaotic or unpredictable, it can mess up the whole wiring process.
And I remember reading about those microglia cells, those tiny maintenance workers in the brain, and their role in pruning those connections.
Ah, yes, the microglia. They're essential for brain development. Think of them like gardeners, pruning away unnecessary connections to make sure the brain network is efficient and healthy. But early stress can mess with how those microglia function, leading to too much or too little pruning, which can disrupt brain development.
So it's like having a gardener who's either overzealous with the shears or not doing enough trimming. Either way, the garden doesn't thrive.
Right, the balance is key.
The article also highlights a specific molecule, corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. Why is that one so important when we're talking about early life stress?
CRH is a major player in our body's response to stress. You know, when you encounter something stressful, your body releases hormones like cortisol to help you cope. Well, CRH is like the conductor of that stress orchestra. It signals the release of those stress hormones. But here's the thing. It's not just in this one little part of the brain that controls those hormones. It's found all over the brain, and its levels can get out of whack after early life stress.
So it's like having the stress alarm going off constantly, even when there's no real danger.
Exactly. And that can have ripple effects throughout the brain, affecting everything from mood to memory to how we experience pleasure.
It's amazing how these tiny molecular changes early on can have such big and lasting effects on our behavior and well-being later in life.
It really is.
So what does all of this mean for us? Why should we care about these mechanisms?
Understanding these mechanisms helps us figure out why some people are more susceptible to mental health problems after early adversity, while others seem to bounce back. It helps us connect the dots between those early experiences and those long-term outcomes.
And it opens up possibilities for developing new ways to help people who've been through tough times, right? Especially with this new understanding of unpredictable early experiences.
Absolutely. By recognizing new forms of early life stress, we can develop more targeted interventions. For example, we might focus on creating more stable and predictable environments for kids, especially those who faced a lot of chaos or inconsistency.
So it's not just about treating the symptoms, it's about addressing the root causes.
Exactly. And it's not just about kids either. This knowledge can help adults who've experienced early adversity to understand themselves better and develop coping strategies.
That's important. The article also mentions a shift in how we think about stress itself, moving beyond just the body's hormonal response.
Right. We used to think of stress primarily as this flood of hormones. But now we're realizing that stress can happen in the brain, at the level of those brain circuits and connections, even without those huge hormonal surges.
So it's like stress can be a silent storm brewing in the brain.
Exactly. And that's important because it means there are probably a lot of early adversities that we haven't fully recognized because they don't trigger that classic stress response.
So we might be underestimating the impact of certain experiences.
It's possible.
Of course, research in this area isn't without its challenges. The article talks about some of the limitations of studying early life stress in humans.
Right. Studying humans is always tricky. It's hard to tease apart the influence of genes from the environment. And obviously, we can't do the same kinds of controlled experiments with humans that we can do with animals.
Right, ethical consideration.
Exactly. So we have to rely on observational studies, which can only tell us so much.
And that's where animal models come in, even though they're not perfect representations of human experience.
Yeah. Animal models are super useful for figuring out cause and effect and for digging into the nitty-gritty details of what's happening in the brain. We can manipulate specific factors and see how that affects brain development and behavior in a controlled way.
It's like having a simplified system where you can isolate specific variables.
Exactly. Of course, we have to be cautious about applying those findings directly to humans. Brains are complex, and different species develop at different rates.
Right, you can't just assume what works in a rat will work in a human.
Definitely not. But animal models give us a starting point, and they help us generate hypotheses that we can then test in humans.
The article also reminds us that this is still a very active area of research, with a lot left to discover.
Oh, absolutely. We're just scratching the surface of understanding early life stress. There's still so many questions to answer. Well, for example, we don't know the exact sensitive periods for different types of stress. We know those periods exist, but we need to pinpoint them more precisely. We also need to understand how sex differences play into the brain's response to adversity.
So how boys and girls might be affected differently.
Exactly. And we're still figuring out the long-term consequences of some of those newer forms of stress, like the unpredictability we talked about.
It sounds like there's a whole lot more to learn.
Definitely. It's an exciting field to be in.
Now, the article includes some really insightful statements that almost act as expert opinions, summarizing some of the key points. Let's go through a few that stood out to me.
Okay, sounds good.
One that really resonated was, we have an incomplete understanding of what is perceived as stressful by the developing brain.
That's a huge one. We often project our own adult understanding of stress onto kids, but their brains are wired differently. What might seem minor to us could be incredibly stressful for a developing brain.
Right. Their world is just different.
Exactly.
Another important one, the timing of stress, that is, during sensitive developmental periods, can have profound effects on long-term outcomes.
This highlights the critical window concept. If a certain brain area is under construction, so to speak, and it gets hit with a stressor, the impact can be much greater than if that same stressor hit later on when that area is more established.
So timing is everything.
Pretty much.
And this next one ties back to our conversation about consistency. Repeated and predictable patterns of sensory stimuli are essential for maturation of brain circuits. This maturation can go awry when these signals are unpredictable.
This underscores how important it is for a kid's environment to be stable and reliable. It's like building a house. If the foundation is shaky, the whole structure is compromised.
Right, those early experiences lay the groundwork for everything that comes after. There's also this statement that helps explain why different research findings sometimes seem to contradict each other. The diverse models of early life stress have identified both overlapping and distinct outcomes. This diversity reflects the multiple and often interacting factors that constitute early life stress.
Basically, early life stress is messy. There are so many different forms, and researchers use different methods to study it. So it's not surprising that the results aren't always neat and tidy.
Makes sense. It's a complex issue.
Very complex.
And finally, these two statements offer a clear way to think about the overall impact of early life stress. Early life stress may be conceptualized as a disruptor of the progressive maturation of brain networks. And in the context of the neurobiological effects and consequences of early life stress, this entity might be best defined as circumstances and experiences that impede or derail cellular and circuit maturation and refinement.
Those are great summaries. They basically tell us that early life stress gets in the way of normal brain development, messing with the growth and fine-tuning of those brain cells and their connections.
It's like throwing a wrench into the machinery.
Exactly. And those disruptions can have ripple effects that last a lifetime.
This has been a really fascinating dive into a topic that affects so many of us. So what's the key takeaway we want to leave our listeners with today?
I think the core message is this. Those early experiences, whether it's the big traumas or those seemingly small, unpredictable things, they really shape our brains. They shape us at a molecular level, at the level of those brain connections, and they can have long-lasting effects on our mental and emotional well-being.
It's not about dwelling on the past or blaming anyone, but about understanding how those early experiences might still be influencing us today.
Exactly.
And as we think about how powerful those early experiences can be, here's a final thought for our listeners. Knowing what we now know, how can we do better for our kids? How can we create more nurturing and predictable environments that support healthy brain development? And how can we foster greater resilience in ourselves, knowing that those early experiences, for better or worse, have shaped who we are today?
Those are great questions to ponder.
We encourage everyone to continue exploring this topic. There's so much more to learn, and the more we understand about early life stress, the better equipped we'll be to support healthy development in ourselves and future generations.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you. Until next time, take care.
Thanks for having me.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about ourselves and how our brains work, the better we can navigate the complexities of life.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.